Ancient Persia. Fearless, formidable, unrelenting. For ages, shrouded in mystery. An empire unparalleled in conquest and riches.
To create an empire of the size of the Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had known, obviously takes military skill.
From North Africa to Asia, it was a civilization driven by a dynasty of extraordinary rulers, ambitious and all-powerful.
Cyrus the Great is one of the few who deserves to be called the Great.
The Persian Empire created some of the most astonishing feats of engineering the world has ever seen. Magnificent palaces that rose up from barren desert. Roadways, bridges, and canals.
Everyone has heard of the Suez Canal, but how many have heard of Darius's Canal?
But dark clouds were on the horizon. An ancient rivalry with Greece would erupt into an epic clash that changed the course of history and shaped the Western world for thousands of years to come. .330 B.C. A young Macedonian king conquers the Persian Empire and leads his invading army into Persepolis, its spectacular capital city. The Macedonian ruler is Alexander the Great, an admirer of the great Persian kings. By sundown, the Greek victory celebration degenerates into a drunken melee. By sunup, Persepolis, the crown jewel of the Persian Empire, with palaces unrivaled anywhere in the world, is burned to the ground. More than 2,500 years later, these immense towers stand as testament to the soaring heights this now forgotten empire once reached.
I equate Persia with luxury, with rich tapestries and beautiful rugs and my mother's fat, fuzzy Persian cat named Otis. But I also think of a fantastic Persian king named Cyrus the Great, who believed in religious and cultural tolerance, and who freed the Jews from Babylon to return to Israel. Hello, I'm Peter Weller, and welcome to the Persian Empire. Around 4000 B.C., two nomadic tribes were starting to take root in a rich but hot Iranian plateau, the Medes in the north, the Persians in the south. Being as that these tribes were nomadic, they were more interested in survival than conquest. As they became less nomadic, they had to learn how to farm, in particular how to cultivate this fertile Iranian plateau. But to do that, they needed a source of water. The early Persians may have very well become dust in the winds of history had they not unlocked a source of water, and just as importantly, a means to channel that water to their crops and settlements. And what makes this engineering feat so remarkable is that they found this water not from rivers or lakes or oceans, but from the most unlikely source of all, rocks.
Persia emerged out of nothing, a rugged, hostile terrain built with only invention and determination. 3,000 years ago, nomadic early Persians roamed the parched, forbidding Iranian plateau. Finding water meant traveling long distances. It fell to a hybrid engineer, geologist and diviner called a Mogani to figure out how to bring it back to his people. Using nothing more than stone chisels, Moganis would build the first cornerstone of the Persian Empire. A breakthrough system of underground irrigation canals called qanats. They began by harnessing gravity to exploit the natural topography of their land, which sloped relentlessly down from the Alborz Mountains towards the Persian Gulf. Vertical shafts were first dug down from the surface, and the tunnel was excavated horizontally for a short distance. Then another vertical shaft was built, approximately 3/4 of a mile up the slope, and the channel continued.
It can be sometimes 20, 30, 40 kilometers away, so it's a very skilled operation, to the point where the gradient of the water channel meets the aquifer, or the groundwater, sloping up at the point where the mountains begin.
The angle of the slope was crucial. 1 unit
According to legend, the city behind me was founded by an orphan suckled by a she-wolf. He took his plough and marked out the limits of the settlement that would bear his name. His name was Romulus, and the city, needless to say, was Rome. In the centuries that followed, the Romans would spread their knowledge, their technology, their way of life across the known world. It was the greatest and most enduring empire the world has ever seen, and some 2,000 years later, it is a know-how that continues to astonish us. In 753 BC, Rome arose from the marshes of the Tiber River. As an eternal student of history, I'm awed by what the Romans accomplished using the most basic technology. Colossal doesn't even come close. Monumental buildings, paved streets and apartment buildings, a water distribution and sewer system that kept 1 million people healthy. Yet Roman technology built more than this city. As the empire grew, that technology spread, shaping the ancient world and reverberating into ours. To understand the role that technology played in building the Roman Empire, I had to go far beyond the capital, out to the frontier. Rome was the heart of an empire stretching from Scotland to Syria. Roman legions occupied 1/4 of the world that would become 36 modern nations. From these German forests on the northern frontier to the Indian Ocean, military might shaped the new world in the image of Rome. Here in Germany, that history is alive. Across the country, experimental archaeologists, like these modern-day Romans, search for clues to the Roman success, down to the smallest detail. Reminders of the Roman occupation are scattered along the frontier. They reflect far more than military conquest. 2,000 years ago, the Romans built a wall here, and this modern reconstruction can give you a sense of the power of the Roman way. It was not just a physical barrier, it was, as much as anything, the edge of an idea. When Roman soldiers stood sentry here, they looked out over a land of uncultured bogs and forest. Behind them, on the other hand, was the Roman world. The legions marched for the glory of Rome and all that it meant. Towns and cities, roads and baths. Organized and well-trained, legionnaires carved the ways of Rome into the colonies, crushing all who opposed them. Roman military success relied heavily on the technology of others. After centuries of warfare, the Romans knew what worked. Much of their military equipment was based on designs adapted from their enemies. Their sword, or gladius, was originally Spanish. Their shields were Samnite. Their armor was derived from a Celtic design. The helmet was Etruscan. With one exception. The pilum was a Roman original. What made it so special was the tip. Shaped like a harpoon, it was designed to penetrate, impossible to pull out. An innovative design, but first, you have to hit the target.
Want to try?
Yes, thank you.
Like this. Straight on the target.
Straight on the target. Okay, we'll see how I go. It's heavy, huh? It's tougher than it looks. Now, in slightly more expert hands, this was an absolutely deadly weapon, and this shows you why. If it's thrown properly, a pilum will go straight through a shield and through the armour of the poor fellow behind it. Even if it doesn't, it was very effective, because as you can see here, it lodges in the shield. Now, a shield with a great big pilum hanging off it may as well be no shield at all. Roman soldiers were well trained in close combat to follow up the pilum attack.
Und los jetzt! Yo!
But adaptability...
The Mongol Empire. The Mongols created the largest empire in history. Their presence was felt strongly in China, Russia, and Islam, though their empire was not very long-lasting. In 1180, a 13-year-old boy was made leader of his tribe when his father was poisoned. The father's name was Temujin, and his tribe, the Yaka Mongols, were a warlike nomadic people in Mongolia. 2/3 of the tribe promptly deserted him, but Temujin soon reunited them and went on to take over other Mongol tribes. In 1206, at a meeting of the Khans, the word for chief, Temujin was hailed as the Genghis Khan, the emperor of all men. He promised that future generations of Mongols would lead lives of luxury. Genghis Khan began a career of conquest by training a ruthless, fast-moving, and well-disciplined army. His hordes terrified their opponents, killing anyone who did not surrender or change sides. In a series of outstanding campaigns, Genghis Khan conquered Turkestan, northern China, and Korea, then swung westward to overrun Afghanistan, Persia, and parts of Russia. Part of his success came from the fact that his opponents were not united. Mongol expansion. After Genghis died, Ogodai and Möngke Khan conquered Armenia, Tibet, more of China, and then ravaged Eastern Europe. Genghis's grandson, Kublai Khan, completed the conquest of China. He made himself the first emperor of the Yuan dynasty. Some aspects of Mongol rule were good. They gave women status, encouraged scholars, respected different religions, and helped trade. They opened the Asian Silk Roads to east-west travelers. Other aspects were not so good. Their ruthless armies destroyed cities and massacred many. However, the Song in southern China were able to resist them for 20 years before they fell, and the Delhi Sultanate stopped them from invading India. In 1260, Mongol expansion had ended. The barbarous Tamerlane. From 1275, a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo spent 17 years at the court of Kublai Khan. His stories gave Europeans their first picture of China and its wealth. After Kublai Khan's death in 1294, the mighty Mongol Empire began to break up. Some Khans, such as the Chagatais in Turkey, or Turkestan, and Ilkhans in Persia, and the Golden Horde in southern Russia, kept smaller empires for themselves. Cruel though the Mongols were, none were as barbarous as the great Mongol-Turkish ruler of Samarkand, Tamerlane, or Timur. His army went on to rampage between 1361 and 1405, and brutally overran Persia, Armenia, Georgia, Mesopotamia, Azerbaijan, and the Golden Horde. Despite his cruel reputation, Tamerlane was a great patron of the arts, astronomy, and architecture in Samarkand. Generally, however, the Mongols left no lasting mark on the world, except for the destruction they brought. China and Russia became poor, the Muslim world was in turmoil, and even European countries like Poland and Serbia suffered greatly. After Tamerlane's death in 1405, the great blood-stained Mongol Empire was over, except in Russia and Turkestan.
England. Once dominated by Roman conquerors, this tiny island nation rose to become one of the largest and most powerful empires in history. Its reach stretched around the globe, spanning every continent.
It was unimaginably large.
Technology, innovation, ambition, these were the tools that built this massive empire and produced the formidable British Navy, a powerhouse that dominated the world's oceans.
The Royal Navy is like the Microsoft of the global system in the 18th and 19th century. They are everywhere.
The British Empire constructed massive symbols of dominance that still invoke awe today. But the foundations of that empire were built on ego, bloodshed, and a relentless drive for conquest. AD, the most powerful empire the world had ever known is under attack. At the far edges of the British Isles, the once mighty Roman legions march toward the coast in full retreat. They leave in their wake a military and political void. For the first time in more than 400 years, the vulnerable island nation of Britain must fend for itself. It was the end of one empire and the beginning of another.
The sun never sets on the British Empire. I've heard those words all my life, ever since I was a kid, even though I've never lived in England, and that empire is long gone. Hello, I'm Peter Weller. At its height, the British Empire covered almost a quarter of the Earth's land mass, some 14 million square miles, and if you think about that, that's just staggering. But how did an island, if you will, in the middle of the North Atlantic come to be such a behemoth empire? Well, in the early 400s AD, when those Roman citizens were fleeing in the face of an onslaught of Vikings and Jutes and Angles and Saxons, some of those marauding and plundering people decided to stay. Maybe they liked the temperate climate. And after several centuries, they'd organized and developed themselves into somewhat of an Anglo or English identity. But with the death of the last true Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, the door was open for another people to step in, the Normans, who were essentially descendants of the Vikings living in northern France. And at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the Normans did that very thing. They took England under the leadership of a man named William, who we call today William the Conqueror.
With a ravenous lust for power, William would stop at nothing to become King of England.
To conquer another country like England, you couldn't really be a sort of touchy-feely kind of person. You had to be a very strong leader, and that's what he was. He was a brutal man.
In 1066, William made his move. He put together an army of Normans and stormed the shores of England. For several bloody hours, his forces viciously clashed with King Harold's near the English coastal town of Hastings. By the end of the day, with one strike, William had conquered England. Now he would borrow a chapter from the Romans and launch a series of extraordinary building projects that would transform the English landscape.
He imposes himself on England and he builds these castles around the country. Now we look at castles and we think, don't they look nice? A Norman castle is not nice. It was big, it towered over your town, and it was a reminder to say that you are under us now. And of course the biggest one he builds is the Tower of London.
William wanted the Tower of London to be intimidating. He chose a location on the bank of the River Thames that had once been used by the Romans. The new tower would be built on those foundations, capitalizing on the Roman legacy of power and glory. The complex would include a defensive wall surrounding an imposing tower.
Can get rid of me. Of course, the people they use to build it are the locals who have to do it, so they use them effectively as slave labor.
Building onto the remains of the Roman walls, workers first constructed the barrier around the complex. On the north and west side, where there were no Roman remains, they dug ditches and erected large wooden stakes as a barricade. Then they turned to the massive tower itself. For 700 years, England had relied on simple timber construction. Now William and the Normans would bring back the grandeur of Roman engineering techniques. Like the Romans, William would build his tower with stone. He didn't trust the quality of the local material, so he imported cream-colored limestone from France. His engineers also incorporated Romanesque arches and vaults within the structure for support. Inside the tower's majestic cathedral, workers constructed a series of intersecting barrel vaults, called groin vaults. These allowed the support to rest on 4 piers, opening a soaring space for windows to lighten the imposing interior.
It was a great feat for that time because the English were used to building in wood, so I think it was rather miraculous for them to see this enormous structure go up. It was really impregnable. I mean, the walls were tremendously thick and there were just little slits to look out from.
The fearsome castle served as a royal residence, fort, stronghold, and prison. And intimidation was backed up by swift and severe reprisal against any who dared challenge the king.
You get armed men, and they go up, and they land on your doorstep. They will drive you out of your home. They will burn your home down. They will burn your crops, so you've got nothing to live on. And a lot of killing, of course.
As the tower neared completion in 1087, William died, ending 21 years of turbulent rule. His imposing fortress would be a reminder of his vision and tyranny for centuries to come. A series of Norman kings succeeded William and continued his work on the complex. But it would be more than 400 years later that the tower would enter its bloodiest phase. And the king who led it there was not Norman, but from the English family of Tudors. He would become one of the most brutal and gluttonous rulers in England's history. His name was Henry VIII. Henry's appetites were legendary. He hungered for food, for women, for power, and for a son who would one day inherit the crown.
The best way to fulfill your duty and your destiny as a king is to produce a safe line of male heirs. And if you look at the portraits of Tudor gentlemen, they're standing with their legs apart and their hands on their hips with these big codpieces. That is not by accident. That is saying, I am virile. Look at me, I can produce families. So a son is a sign of manhood.
When his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, failed to produce a son, Henry set his sights on one of her ladies-in-waiting, the alluring Anne Boleyn.
He falls absolutely hopelessly in both in love and in lust with Anne Boleyn, because Anne is a very, very sexy lady, and she knows it. There's only one problem. How do you get rid of your wife? Apart from murdering her, of course. And the answer is, I've got to divorce her.
When the Pope refused to grant Henry a divorce, the king flew into a rage. If he couldn't control his country's religion, he would simply replace it. He boldly severed all ties with Rome and appointed himself head of the new Church of England. Henry now had absolute control over his country. He divorced Catherine and made Anne his queen. But when she also failed to produce a son, she suddenly found herself accused of adultery.
The case is made as damaging as it's possible to be, that she's not just having one affair, that she's having a string of affairs, that there are sort of orgies going on in the palace, and Henry is only too ready to believe a lot of this.
Henry had Anne arrested and held in the greatly expanded Tower of London. By now, the tower complex had grown to a sprawling 18 acres with an impenetrable facade. The wooden barricade had been replaced and expanded by thick stone walls. A series of towers reinforced their strength and stability. 330 B.C., a young Macedonian king conquers the Persian Empire and leads his invading army into Persepolis, its spectacular capital city. The Macedonian ruler is Alexander the Great, an admirer of the great Persian kings. By sundown, the Greek victory celebration degenerates into a drunken melee. By sunup, Persepolis, the crown jewel of the Persian Empire, with palaces unrivaled anywhere in the world, is burned to the ground. More than 2,500 years later, These immense towers stand as testament to the soaring heights this now forgotten empire once reached.
I equate Persia with luxury, with rich tapestries and beautiful rugs and my mother's fat, fuzzy Persian cat named Otis. But I also think of a fantastic Persian king named Cyrus the Great, who believed in religious and cultural tolerance, and who freed the Jews from Babylon to return to Israel. Hello, I'm Peter Weller, and welcome to the Persian Empire. Around 4000 B.C., two nomadic tribes were starting to take root in a rich but hot Iranian plateau. The Medes in the north, the Persians.
Ancient Persia. Fearless, formidable, unrelenting. For ages, shrouded in mystery. An empire unparalleled in conquest and riches.
To create an empire of the size of the Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had known, obviously takes military skill.
From North Africa to Asia, it was a civilization driven by a dynasty of extraordinary rulers, ambitious and all-powerful.
Cyrus the Great is one of the few who deserves to be called the Great.
The Persian Empire created some of the most astonishing feats of engineering the world has ever seen. Magnificent palaces that rose up from barren desert. Roadways, bridges, and canals.
Everyone has heard of the Suez Canal, but how many have heard of Darius's Canal?
But dark clouds were on the horizon. An ancient rivalry with Greece would erupt into an epic clash that changed the course of history and shaped the Western world for thousands of years to come.
Persians in the south. Being is that these tribes were nomadic, they were more interested in survival than conquest. As they became less nomadic, they had to learn how to farm, in particular how to cultivate this fertile Iranian plateau. But to do that, they needed a source of water. The early Persians may have very well become dust in the winds of history had they not unlocked a source of water and, just as importantly, a means to channel that water to their crops and settlements. And what makes this engineering feat so remarkable is that they found this water not from rivers or lakes or oceans, but from the most unlikely source of all, rocks.
Persia emerged out of nothing.